The doors of the plane closed with a faint hiss, and the hum of the engines roared to life. The young teenager stood frozen in the aisle, eyes wide, his heart thudding against his chest. The flight attendant noticed him immediately. She had seen nervous flyers before, but something about this boy felt different. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the armrest tightly, his face pale and beads of sweat starting to form along his forehead. He tried to act normal, but anyone who looked closely could see he was struggling just to breathe. His eyes darted around the cabin, searching for something, anything to hold on to. He didn't belong here, he didn't want to be here, but somehow he had to. The flight attendant walked down the aisle, greeting passengers. As she always did, she was used to seeing first-time flyers who were nervous about their flight. But this teenager had an energy about him that caught her attention. He wasn't just nervous, it was something deeper, something that she couldn't put her finger on. As she passed him, she offered a quick smile, but he didn't return it. Instead, he looked at her like he was begging her for help, as if she could see the storm raging inside of him. But she moved on, thinking it was just another case of a scared young traveler who would settle down once the plane took off. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the rumble of the engines grew louder, and the teen's fingers clenched harder around the armrest. He tried to take slow breaths, but they came out in shallow gasps. His face tightened, as if he were preparing for something he couldn't control. His gaze was locked out the window, staring at the runway below, as if he could escape the moment if he stared hard enough. The flight attendant caught a glimpse of him. As she passed by again, this time she noticed the faint tremor in his shoulders. His body was shaking, and it wasn't from the cold air conditioning or the nerves of flying. It was something more. It wasn't normal. The plane's engines roared louder as they began to ascend into the sky. The teen's breath caught in his throat, and he leaned forward, slightly gripping the armrests even tighter. Now his knuckles were almost as white as the seat back in front of him. His eyes were wide and frantic. The flight attendant watched from the corner of her eye. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her gut. But she hesitated. There were other passengers to check on, and the flight had only just begun. But the teen's distress kept pulling her attention back to him. He looked like a man about to face his worst nightmare. But the plane was still climbing, still gaining altitude. The passengers around him were calm, unaware of the silent battle unfolding just a few rows ahead. She took a deep breath and decided to check on him. Maybe he just needed a few comforting words to calm down. Maybe he just needed to know he wasn't alone. She walked up to him, her steps quiet, her voice soft, but her tone was filled with concern. She leaned in and asked, "Are you all right?" Her eyes searched his face for any sign of comfort, but what she saw made her stomach churn. The teen's lips quivered as he looked up at her, his face pale and sweat running down his cheeks. His eyes held a fear that went beyond any regular flight anxiety. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, his body jerked forward as if he was fighting for control of his own breath. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He couldn't seem to get enough air. And that was when she saw it. His body was trembling violently, as if he had no control over it. She froze for a moment in disbelief. This was no ordinary nervous passenger. The flight attendant hesitated for just a moment, unsure of what to do next. The young teen's body continued to shake uncontrollably, his breath shallow and erratic, his chest rising and falling so fast. It was like he was suffocating right in front of her. She had seen anxiety before, but this was different. This wasn't just fear of flying. This was something deeper, something she couldn't understand. His face was pale, his eyes wild, and there was a desperate look in them, like he was drowning. But no one could see it. He wasn't just nervous, he was terrified. In a way she couldn't explain. The thought crossed her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. This couldn't be something serious, not on a flight like this, not in a crowded cabin with people chatting and relaxing around them. She knelt beside him, lowering her voice to try and calm him down, but her words felt like they were falling flat against the rushing sounds of the plane engines. and the anxiety that hung in the air. She placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, trying to steady him, but his body jerked away, as if he couldn't bear anyone to touch him. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had vanished for him. It was just him. And the terror twisting inside him, she felt a surge of empathy mixed with confusion. Her mind raced. She had to do something. But what could she do? She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't equipped to handle something like this. His breathing grew more frantic, and she realized the teen wasn't just reacting to the turbulence or the altitude. His body was betraying him in a way that she could feel in her own chest. His hands gripped the armrests like a lifeline, and she saw his fingers curl and uncurl desperately, as if he were trying to control the tremors that racked his body. But they wouldn't stop. They kept coming faster, harder, until his shoulders shook violently, and his eyes darted around the cabin, as if he were looking for an escape from whatever was happening to him. The flight attendant's stomach twisted with anxiety, and for the first time she couldn't just smile and offer words of comfort to calm a nervous passenger. This wasn't something she could fix with a few kind words. This was real. This was urgent. She leaned closer, her voice now softer, more concerned. "Can I help you with something? Are you okay?" She tried again, but he couldn't answer her, mouth dry, his eyes locked on hers. But his lips barely moved. No words came, just a low sound of panic escaping him. And that's when she saw it. His gaze shifted quickly from her to the window as the plane climbed higher into the sky. His panic was escalating, and she felt an uneasy sense of dread creeping over her. And then he did something that sent chills down her spine. He gasped for air like someone drowning in deep water, his chest heaving as he tried to inhale, but couldn't. His face contorted in pain and terror. And she knew immediately this wasn't just anxiety. He wasn't simply afraid of flying. He was struggling to breathe, his body fighting against him, like it was trapped in its own fight for survival. She could see it now. The signs were clear. But she couldn't understand what was happening. She had to act fast. But she didn't know what to do. She was just a flight attendant, not a doctor, not a medical professional. But every instinct in her told her that something was seriously wrong. "Can you breathe?" she asked him again, this time her voice cracking with concern. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his hands clawing at his chest, as if trying to rip the air into his lungs. The flight attendant felt her heart race, her mind spinning. What should she do? Should she call for help? Should she tell the captain? Should she take him to the back of the plane and try to calm him down? But she was paralyzed by the fear that this moment could be much more serious than she had ever prepared for. The flight attendant's pulse quickened, her mind raced. She could feel the panic rising in her own chest as she watched the teenager struggle to breathe. His body was trembling so violently now that his entire seat seemed to shake with him. His hands were clutching the armrests so tightly that his fingers were turning white. His face was twisted in a silent scream of terror. And it was then she realized just how helpless he looked, like someone trapped inside their own body, unable to escape the suffocating fear that had taken hold of him. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand here and watch him fight for air. She had to act fast. But what could she do? She was just a flight attendant, a person who could offer comforting words and directions. But right now, none of those things felt enough. She knew she needed to stay calm, but the sheer desperation in his eyes made it nearly impossible. Her breath came in shallow gasps. As she reached for the intercom, she had to tell the captain something was wrong. She had to get medical help. But before she could speak, she heard him whisper, barely audible, "I can't breathe." His voice cracked with a kind of fear that made her stomach churn and her heart ache for him. She had never seen anyone in such distress on a flight before, and for a moment she was frozen, paralyzed by the realization that the teen's situation was far worse than she had imagined. The teen's head was now slumped forward, as if he had no energy left to keep it upright. His chest was rising and falling rapidly in uneven bursts, Like a panicked animal gasping for air, his eyes were wide with panic, his pupils dilated, and his skin was pale, as though he had lost all circulation. His body was fighting something she couldn't see or understand. But it was clear he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, and fast. But the plane was in the air. There was no easy way out. The thought made her stomach drop. She had to figure something out. She had to keep him from spiraling further. She looked around the cabin, but no one seemed to notice the growing chaos around them. People were absorbed in their own little worlds, staring at their screens or reading their books, completely oblivious to the crisis. Unfolding just a few rows away, her attention snapped back to the teen. His body was still shaking, his breathing shallow and gasping now, and she felt her own breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just anxiety. This wasn't just a panic attack. There was something seriously wrong. She didn't know if it was an allergic reaction or something worse. But in that moment, it didn't matter what it was. All that mattered was making sure this boy was okay. She leaned down closer to him, her voice soft, but filled with urgency. "Hey, listen to me. I need you to stay with me, okay?" Her hand rested gently on his shoulder, but he barely reacted. He was so out of it. He seemed lost in his own world, unable to hear her words, or even recognize she was there. She shook him lightly, trying to get his attention. "Hey, stay with me. We're going to get you help. Just breathe with me, okay?" She could hear herself now pleading, but there was no response, only the sound of his panicked breathing as his body continued to tremble and his chest heaved with each failed attempt to inhale. The plane's hum seemed to fade into the background as she focused solely on the teen. His shaking was slowing down, but his breathing was still too shallow and ragged. He needed medical attention, but there was no way for her to know if they could get him the help he needed. In time, her heart pounded as she frantically looked toward the cockpit. She had to make the call now. She pressed the intercom button and spoke quickly. "This is Flight Attendant 23. We have an emergency. I need medical assistance immediately. There's a passenger who's not breathing properly, and he's shaking violently. Please advise on the next steps." She didn't wait for a response. Instead, she turned back to the teen, who was still struggling. She couldn't lose him. She couldn't. The seconds felt like hours as the flight attendant knelt beside the teen, her mind a blur of panic and determination. She had never been in a situation like this. Before, she had always been trained to deal with nervous flyers. But this was something else entirely. The teen's breathing was still ragged, his chest heaving, as if his lungs couldn't expand enough to draw in air. His body had stopped shaking, but his skin remained pale and clammy, and the fear in his eyes hadn't faded one bit. It was like he was trapped inside a nightmare, unable to escape no matter how hard he tried. She could feel her heart racing with every breath she took, but she couldn't let herself fall apart. She had to be strong for him. She had to be his lifeline right now. She reached over to gently hold his hand. It was cold and trembling, but it was the only connection she had to him right now. She squeezed it softly, her voice shaking but firm. "I need you to listen to me, okay? Stay with me just a little longer. Help is on the way." She could barely get the words out without her own voice cracking, but she had to stay calm. She had to be the one who kept her composure. For a moment, there was only silence between them as the teen continued to struggle to breathe, his eyes never leaving hers, as if he were searching for some sign of hope. She couldn't give him any answers she didn't have, but she could give him her presence, her support. She didn't know if it would be enough, but it was all she had to offer right now. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth and gasped again for air, his face twisted in silent anguish as he fought for every breath, and for the first time she realized just how close to the edge he was. Her gaze snapped back to the intercom button she had pressed earlier. She had called for medical assistance, but there was still no response. She needed help now. She couldn't wait any longer. The teen was slipping further away, and she felt it with every passing second. She reached for the intercom again, but this time she hit the button with more force and urgency. "Flight Attendant 23 to cockpit emergency. I need help now. The passenger is struggling to breathe. And I don't know what's happening. Please respond." The words felt heavy as they left her lips, but there was no time to waste. There was no time for hesitation. She could hear the frantic beeping of the intercom, signaling that someone on the other end had finally picked up "Flight Attendant 23. This is the cockpit. Go ahead." The voice was calm, but she could hear the underlying tension in it. She barely had time to explain what was happening. "We have a medical emergency. Passenger is in severe distress, unable to breathe properly, and I need assistance now. Please send help." She could feel the sweat on her brow as she waited for a response. Every second felt like an eternity. The teen was still gasping for air, his chest moving up and down too quickly, his hands clutching her own now, his grip tight. But weak, his eyes were wide with terror, and for the first time she saw something else in them, something that made her stomach drop. Resignation, like he had given up, like he didn't think he could make it much longer. The voice from the cockpit came back, faster now. "We're diverting to the nearest airport. We're going to get you help. Just stay with him. We're on it." The words gave her a glimmer of hope, but it was so small compared to the fear swelling in her chest. She looked back at the teen, who was barely holding on, his eyes fluttering, as if he were losing consciousness. She could see the strain in his face, the desperation in his breath, and for a moment she thought he might pass out any second. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let him slip away. The flight attendant leaned closer to him, pressing her forehead gently against his. For a moment she closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, hoping with all her heart that he could hold on just a little longer until help arrived. She squeezed his hand once more and tried to steady her own breath for the both of them. The minutes stretched into eternity. As the plane cut through the sky, she could only hope that the assistance she needed would come soon enough. The minutes stretched on, but every second felt like an eternity. The flight attendant kept her hand tightly gripping the teen's, as if by holding on to him she could somehow keep him tethered to the world around him. His face had grown even paler, and the shallow gasps for air were becoming more desperate with every passing moment. His eyes fluttered, but never fully closed. It was as if his body was fighting to stay conscious, but his mind had already started slipping away. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. The realization that she might lose him at any moment made her stomach churn and her hands tremble. But she couldn't let herself give in. She had to be strong. She had to make sure he didn't slip away. The plane's cabin was eerily quiet now, passengers around them completely oblivious to the crisis. Unfolding just a few rows ahead, the flight attendant had blocked out everything except the teen's labored breathing, and the pulse in his hand that was growing weaker with each passing moment. She pressed her other hand gently against his chest, trying to feel for any sign that his heart was still strong, but there was nothing steady about it. It was erratic, skipping beats, and then pounding again, as if his body were fighting itself, but not winning. She didn't know how much longer he could hold on. Her mind raced for a solution, but she knew there was nothing more she could do. There were no medical supplies on board that could help him, not in the way he needed, and she was just a flight attendant, not a trained medical professional. She had done all she could. She had called for help. She had tried to calm him, and now she was just waiting for the plane to land, or for someone to come and take over. She didn't know which one would come first, but she hoped it wouldn't be too late. Every time the teen inhaled, it was like watching a fragile plant struggling to survive in the harshest conditions. Each breath came harder and harder, his chest rising and falling with an almost painful intensity. She could see the panic in his eyes now. His lips were cracked from the effort to get air, and his body was slick with sweat. As if he had run a race, he looked like he was in the middle of some terrible fight against an invisible enemy that had no mercy. And she couldn't fight it for him. She could only stand by and pray that help would arrive soon enough. She glanced quickly toward the cockpit. She hadn't heard anything for what felt like an eternity had they diverted the plane. Yet, Were they close to landing? What was taking so long? She couldn't wait anymore. The flight attendant's nerves were stretched thin. She needed action. She needed results. She needed to see that they were doing something to save him, or she would lose him. And the thought of that left a deep hollow feeling inside her chest. She swallowed hard, trying to push the fear down, but it crept up again like a shadow. It was hard to breathe herself, with the weight of the moment hanging over her, the teen's life literally in her hands, and there was nothing else she could do but wait. The seconds turned into minutes, and then there it was, the low hum of the intercom crackled through the cabin, and she froze. The voice from the cockpit came through with a sharp urgency. "Flight Attendant 23, we're close to the airport, hold on, help," is on the ground waiting. Hearing those words should have brought relief, but instead it sent a wave of dread through her, because in those moments the teen's condition had worsened so much she wasn't sure if he could make it to the ground. He was struggling more now with every breath. It was almost as if he were fighting the very air around him, his chest heaving violently as his body seemed to lose its fight against whatever was taking him down. And as she looked down at him, his hand squeezing hers one final time, she couldn't help but wonder if it was too late, if he could hold on for just a few more minutes, if the help he needed would come in time to save him, or if she would watch him slip away right in front of her. The sound of the engines roared in the background, but to the flight attendant it felt distant, like a muffled echo. As she focused all her attention on the teen, his breath had become even more labored, shallow and rapid gasps that barely seemed to give him any relief. Each time his chest rose, it seemed like it might be the last time, the way his body jerked and convulsed, as if fighting against something far stronger than him. And all she could do was watch helplessly. The tears she had been holding back threatened to spill, but she refused to let them fall. She had to stay composed. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. The teen's grip on her hand tightened, then loosened again, as if his strength was slipping away. His eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and she thought for a terrifying second that he had finally succumbed to whatever invisible force had taken over him. His lips were parted in a desperate attempt to draw in more air, but it was like the oxygen itself was slipping away from him. He wasn't just panicking anymore, he was suffocating, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She leaned in closer, her voice soft yet trembling, as she whispered, "Stay with me, please, stay with me." But it felt like her words were being swallowed by the overwhelming noise of the plane, the roar of the engines, and the racing of her own heartbeat that drowned out everything else. Her eyes flickered over to the cabin crew's seat, but no one was watching. They were all preoccupied with their own tasks, and the passengers around them had no idea that a life was hanging in the balance. Just a few rows away, she wanted to scream for help, but she couldn't take her eyes off the teen. She had to be there for him. She had to hold on for him when he could no longer do it for himself. The intercom crackled again, and the voice from the cockpit came through, urgent but calm. "Flight Attendant 23, we're moments away from the airport. Prepare for emergency landing, and keep your seatbelt fastened. We'll get you help." She didn't even hear the rest of the message. She was too focused on the teen. His breathing had become so shallow now, it was almost imperceptible. He wasn't gasping anymore. He wasn't struggling anymore. His body was still, and his hand in hers was limp. She felt a cold chill run through her body as a sinking feeling spread through her chest. She couldn't lose him. Not like this, not when they were so close to getting him the help he needed. The words from the cockpit echoed in her mind as she fought to keep the panic at bay. They were moments away from landing. They were almost there. But was it too late? Would they make it in time? She could feel her heart pounding in her ears as she glanced once more at the teen. He was so still now, his chest barely rising and falling, and it hit her like a ton of bricks. He had stopped breathing. There was no rise and fall, no gasp for air, just stillness. She could hear her own breath catch in her throat as she leaned closer to him and checked for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there, but it wasn't strong enough. He wasn't breathing on his own, and the thought that they might not make it to the runway in time was suffocating. Her hands were shaking as she checked his pulse again, praying for any sign of life. But there was nothing. His skin was cool to the touch, his body limp, and the air around them seemed to thicken. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think. All she could do was feel the weight of the moment. As the seconds ticked, by one, she pressed the button for the intercom. Once more, her voice shakier this time. "Emergency landing, we need medical assistance. Now please, we need help now." The words felt like they were falling into an abyss. As the silence of the cabin swallowed her whole, she wanted to scream, she wanted to do anything, but all she could do was hold his hand and pray that somehow he would find the strength to keep going, that he would hold on long enough to be saved. The seconds stretched like hours. The flight attendant's breath was shallow as she leaned over the teen, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that it drowned out the sound of the engines. She could feel the chill of the air around them, and the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. His body was still too still, his skin was cold to the touch, and the slight pulse she had felt earlier was now nothing more than a faint thud, barely detectable. She refused to give up. She couldn't let go of him, not yet, not when there was still a chance. But each breath she took felt harder to manage as the panic crept in. She had no training for this. She was just a flight attendant, not a doctor. She had no idea what was happening to him, or what was causing it. But she knew one thing for sure: he couldn't die, not here, not now, not on her watch. The voices on the intercom became a distant hum in the background. Her mind was consumed with the teen's lifeless form in front of her, his chest unmoving, and her own pulse hammering in her ears. She squeezed his hand again, harder this time, praying for any sign of life, praying that somehow he would squeeze back. But there was nothing. His hand was cold and limp, and the silence around them seemed to grow thicker and heavier, like the air itself had become too dense to breathe. She was losing him, and she could feel it in her bones, but she wouldn't let herself believe it. She wouldn't accept it. The flight attendant quickly glanced toward the cabin door again, desperate for help. She could see the cockpit door had been opened, and a flight attendant from the back of the plane was rushing forward. But there was no time to wait. She turned back to the teen and reached for his chest, her hands shaking as she tried to find his heartbeat again. It was so faint, it was almost gone. But it was there, it was still there for now, and that was enough to give her hope, to give her something to hold on to. The intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice came through loud and clear this time. "Flight attendant 23, we're landing in 2 minutes. Hold on, help is waiting for you on the ground." Those words should have been a relief, but instead they felt like a cruel reminder of how little time they had left. She looked down at the teen, his face still pale, and his body unresponsive, and it hit her like a wave of ice-cold fear. He wasn't going to make it. She didn't want to believe it, but the reality was sinking in, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She pressed her hand to his chest again, trying to force some kind of response, some kind of miracle, but it didn't come. The teen's body was limp beneath her touch, and she fought to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. She couldn't break down now, not when they were so close. She needed him to hold on just a little longer, and then he could be saved. As the plane descended lower, the flight attendant could feel the pressure building in her chest. The tension in the cabin was palpable, every passenger aware that something was wrong, but no one truly understanding the gravity of the situation. She wasn't just a flight attendant. She wasn't just there to serve drinks and snacks. She was the one standing between life and death for this young boy, and she had no idea if she could win this battle. The teen's body jerked suddenly, his head lolling to one side, and for a split second she thought he was gone. But then she saw it. His chest rose slightly, a breath too shallow to be called a real breath. But it was something. It was enough to make her freeze in place, for a heartbeat, a breath, a flicker of life, a spark of hope. And she could barely believe it. She held her breath and waited for the next one, praying it wasn't a fluke, praying that he was still with her, still fighting. The plane was descending now, and the flight attendant's heart was in her throat. Her hands were trembling as she kept her eyes fixed on the teen's chest, praying for any sign of life, as the seconds seemed to slip away faster and faster. His breathing was still shallow, so shallow that she could barely tell if it was real or if it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But then it happened, a small but unmistakable rise of his chest, like a flicker of hope in the middle of a storm, the faintest of breaths, just enough to tell her he wasn't gone yet. But how long could he last? She didn't know how much longer his body could fight this silent battle against whatever was threatening to take him from her. Her pulse raced as the plane's descent became steeper. She could feel the pressure building around them, the sound of the engines roaring in her ears, the vibration of the aircraft shaking with each passing moment. The teen's face was still ashen, his lips a pale blue, and his body limp. But that single breath, that single flicker of life, kept her from breaking down. She clung to it like a lifeline. But she knew it wasn't enough, not yet, not when they were so close to the ground, but so far from safety. The intercom crackled again, the captain's voice now a steady, calm force. Flight Attendant 23, we are 30 seconds from landing. Prepare for emergency response teams. They'll be waiting on the runway. The words barely registered. Her mind was consumed by the teen's still form, by the tenuous grip she had on him, and the terrifying thought that he might not make it through the landing. She squeezed his hand. Once more, her voice a whisper. Please don't give up, please stay with me. But there was no answer, just the sound of the engines and the frantic beat of her own heart. As the plane touched down, the force of the landing jolted her forward, and she had to brace herself against the teen's body. Her heart skipped a beat as the sudden motion shook in his body, shifting, but still no real response. And she felt her stomach drop. The emergency response teams had to be close, they had to be, but were they close enough? Would they make it in time, or had they already lost him? Was this the moment she would have to say goodbye? The plane's wheels screeched against the runway as it came to a halt, and the cabin erupted into motion. But the flight attendant couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes never leaving the teen's face. She was waiting for a miracle, waiting for a sign, anything to tell her that he wasn't gone. But the moments dragged on, and the world around her seemed to blur into a haze. The sound of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts, the overhead compartments opening, all of it seemed so distant to her. All that mattered was him. Then she heard it, the rush of footsteps down the aisle, and the voices of medical personnel entering the cabin. There was a rush of activity as they swarmed around the teen, checking his vitals and immediately preparing to administer oxygen. She barely noticed their words as they began to work. She only heard the faint murmur of their voices and the soft sounds of equipment being adjusted. But it didn't matter, because something had shifted. The teen's chest had risen again, this time more noticeably than before, and his lips were still pale, but there was a faint pink tint returning to them, a sign that maybe, just maybe, he had been holding on for this very moment. Her breath caught in her throat as one of the medics looked at her and nodded reassuringly. He's stabilizing. The words barely made it past her ears, but when they did, she felt a rush of relief. Unlike anything she'd ever known, she could finally exhale for the first time in what felt like hours. Her body had been running on pure adrenaline, and now that the danger had passed her legs, that felt like jelly. Her strength had been drained, but she stayed by his side, watching as the medics continued to work with careful precision. They had saved him for now. But she knew it wasn't over. He wasn't out of the woods yet. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to hope again, hope that he would make it, hope that this terrifying ordeal was finally over.